When I first got exposed to periodization, my first thought was, geez, that's a bit complicated, isn't it? And the way it was being taught, the second question I said is, they're teaching it as this is how you do it, and I don't agree. So what I did is I started to come up with my own solutions. And when I first taught people my solutions, the initial response was one of rejection and ridicule. And ultimately my methods have been adopted by people around the world, and in many cases you don't even know it. Because in many instances, especially in the fitness industry publications, when they publish, they don't like to reference. They seek to take credit for themselves. In sport, they do sometimes reference, so some of the concepts do come back. So you're going to get some insights into the origin of that today. So let's start off with the concept of periodization. This is the conclusion that I made. So I said the concept of periodization is being taught in a really confusing way, and it's being taught that this is what periodization means. And I said that doesn't feel right to me. And I said, really, periodization is nothing more than planning. And I taught that periodization as a synonym could be equally explained with the word planning. It's nothing more than creating a plan. Now, just to get real clear, what was happening in the early 80s in the teaching periodization, they'd say, okay, this is how you periodize. And I said, no, that's not right. They said, you go like this, you go aerobic base, and then you do this, and you do this, and you do this. This is. And they were selling the package, and I didn't agree with the package. And I was one of the first in the world to say that aerobic base onwards there's no real science to it. It's a myth. There's no justification for it, and we can do it better, which was what we did. And my approach to the periodization of endurance in particular has been used in sports around the world, in more sports than you probably appreciate. So this is your challenge, creating a plan. Now let's understand how the planning rolls, because also what was being taught in the early 80s was it was a plan for the year. But I want you to take it a bit deeper than that. Creating a plan and ultimately is creating a plan for the training of the life of a human being. And we're working in an environment where we're pretty much what, an 85, 86 average age in the Western world, around that era. So I'll just use 80 as a generalisation. Now, I had the pleasure of working with a man in skiing. The Canadian ski team hired me for about 10 years. I used to get flown into Canada on a regular basis to work with them. And one of the sports science director at the time was a fellow called Istvan Barley. Or Bailly. He was a Hungarian. He'd represented his country in swimming in the 64 Olympics. And had taken on the subject of periodization as one of his passions. And so that was back in about 1990, 89, when I started working with him. And ironically, about 20 years later, his teachings are starting to come through the Americans. We were in Park City a year or two ago, and they would tell us about this new idea called long-term athlete development. So they're only about 20 years behind. But if you want to study long-term athlete development, he's definitely been a leader. And prior to that, my earlier influences were an author by the name of Tudor Bompa, B-O-M-P-A, Tudor Bompa. Also Hungarian, as I understand it. So there have been excellent influences. There are others, but certainly if you don't have those two books on the shelf, I'm not sure if this has actually published the book, but he's written extensively. In fact, he's been hired by many sports around the world to come and teach his model of long-term periodization, multi-year periodization. Tudor Bompa wrote a classic book in about 1983, Theory and Methodology of Training, sensational book. Not an easy read, but worth having on your shelf and worth making an effort to study.